Hello and welcome back to 5-Minute Bibliography from Pequot Library. I am and continue to be your host, Dr. Jamie Cumby. I'm Pequot's Special Collections Librarian, and this week, as promised, we're doing a mailbag segment. So we've asked you guys for your questions, things that might have come up that you were curious about over the course of watching this series, and I'm going to try and answer some of them. So we're going to kick things off with a question from Kendra, who asks, some of my favorite greeting cards are called letterpress. Would the process to produce them be similar to what was done by Gutenberg? In a word, yes. So letterpress means that your cards were produced using pieces of type. In some cases, you might describe something as letterpress if it was produced using some of the hot type machines that were invented later on in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, your monotype and your linotype machines, where you can cast actually a whole block of text in one go. But it might also mean that these cards are printed using small hand presses. Hopefully we'll get to see a demonstration of one of those in action, using pieces of type that are set up pretty much exactly as they would have been done 500 years ago, but with some modifications because the types of presses that we use today are pretty different from Gutenberg's gigantic, entirely wooden press. I mean, the first thing you think about, the level of friction that you have when your press uses a wooden spindle. I mean, you lose a lot of energy that way. But I digress. Basically, letterpress means done with pieces of type. And now we've got a question from Susan. And she asks, what was early glue made of and how was it made? So there are two different kinds of adhesives that we see in medieval and early modern bindings. There's animal-based glues and there are plant-based glues. Animal-based glues use the collagen that's present in animal skins and tendons and cartilage and bones, basically the kinds of byproducts that you'd have from a tannery or a butcher shop. And those are reduced to make gelatin. And it's that unrefined gelatin that you use. Often you actually see it in sizing paper, more often than you necessarily see it in book bindings, but it's still a component of the bookmaking process. Plant-based pastes use starch as their binding agent. So typically you'll see flour. This is actually the most common adhesive that you see in bookbinding, and you see traces of flour actually in the adhesives on 9th century books. So it's super early that we see these emerging. But of course, evidence is hard to find because that kind of stuff breaks down. One thing to note is that some of the early adhesive recipes for bookbinding actually use a combination of rye flour and animal glues. So likely what we're seeing in most early book production is either predominantly a starch-based glue or a combination of animal glue and starch glue. And now we're going to move on to a question from Jen. And Jen asks, if I understand correctly, the West started binding books the way they did because the Coptic way made books too unstable. Is that correct? Or is it because Western binders found the Coptic stitch too time-consuming? I picked this question because it's a really complicated one, but I think it touches on some really fascinating themes that I am really excited to dive into. So first, we should talk about what the Coptic stitch does. It uses a stitch that's called a link stitch. It loops the different gatherings. We also call these gatherings quires. We gather them together. And you actually see this sewing structure in artist books today. And also, it's really popular in modern sketchbooks. And that's because if we think about the benefits of this sewing style, where there isn't a central support around which the book is constructed, link-stitched or Coptic books can actually lie perfectly flat really easily. This stitching is also surprisingly durable, but it makes a binding that's very pliable and movable, so you don't get the same kind of rigid, reinforced structure that you would get if you were sewing on rigid supports. So you can kind of see there are some pros and cons of both. And it becomes evident that in medieval Europe, binders tended to favor this more rigid structure because it provided a more, a kind of a less pliable, less movable support structure. But answering the question of when and why Western bookbinding made that shift is really difficult because the evidence is really thin on the ground. The very earliest evidence for sewing on supports comes from the 8th century. And that's when monastic binderies started to use thin vegetable fiber cords that reinforce the spines of books. The sewing around these cords, which are thinner than the bands that you see later on, are sewn in what's called a herringbone stitch. And that's simply because the looping around the cords, when you see it together, makes a kind of herringbone pattern. But the twist is, herringbone sewing is actually just link sewing, but it looks different because it's done around a cord. These link stitch bindings, these Coptic bindings, and early sewing supports with herringbone stitches actually coexist in early medieval Europe. So remember how I said that the very first evidence of sewing on supports comes from the 8th century? Well, those books come from a monastery in Reichenau, in a Benedictine abbey. Reichenau is in is on Lake Constance in southern Germany. And the bindings at Reichenau have a combination of Coptic stitching and stitching on supports with herringbone stitching. So we see that these two methods are being used at the same time in the same setting. We know that Europe shifted over to sewing on supports because it kind of became standard practice by the 11th century, but a lot of these early books that would have provided evidence for this transitional period and would have given us more to go on to see, what would have made a binder favor one stitching method over the other, is because a lot of these have been destroyed with the usual things that tend to destroy objects. Overuse, pests, fire, fungus, floods, all the typical enemies of books, so to speak. But tragically, another major factor in why a lot of these books are lost is because of the overzealous efforts of early people attempting to make restorations of early books or update bindings to be more beautiful. That's caused a lot of really early, really precious manuscripts to be totally deterritorialized from these essential early bindings that provide this extraordinary evidence about how they were used and disseminated. So that's my plug, to leave your grubby old books alone. I'm just going to try and get through one last question before we end. I know we're kind of running over our 5 minutes, but I did get a lot of questions about urine from the papermaking video. So I'll just run through a little bit more detail how rags are processed in paper mills. Urine is actually a really popular chemical in medieval and early modern Europe. It's because urea breaks down into ammonia, which is a caustic agent. And tons and tons of crafts actually use stale urine, which would have a high ammonia content. And that did things like it made leather soft and pliable. And also, if you think about your typical household cleaner, which I bet, if you run and grab it and look at the label, it has a pretty high ammonia content. It also acts as a fantastic cleaning agent. And a lot of medieval and early modern laundries use stale ammonia-rich pee to help break down the dirt and grease that would adhere to rags. It was actually really, really good at getting stains out of cloth, and sometimes people would even prefer it to using lye or more traditional soaps that we, think about today as being perhaps more clean seeming. So urine was a really important part of the cleaning process for rags that came into the paper mill because it was absolutely essential that the rags that were used to make paper are totally removed of stains and incidental bits of matter that would then find their way into the paper, either by causing discoloration or by having little bits of stuff show up when the vat man is dipping the mold into the vat of pulp. After the rags are cleaned, then there's another process called retting, which is actually a kind of fermentation of the now clean rags. And that is almost like wild fermentation for beer today. You'd have your rags that have been cleaned sitting in a vat. The biggest component there is clean fresh water, typically from the stream that's powering the mill. But the chemical secrets of that were closely guarded by different mills. And that process could vary just as much as the climate itself, which again is why sometimes the comparison to wild fermentation for beer is perhaps appropriate. And yeah, I hope that's cleared up some things for you. I see my assistant has come to join us again. Keep sending your questions and we'll do another segment like this, and hope to hear from you guys soon. Have a great week.